Episode 18. What does adding value actually mean? Hello, I'm Alexander von der Fellen, and this is the Next Gen Mentor podcast. This series is for you if you've grown up with family wealth always there in the background, sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing, and often not spoken about. And now that wealth is becoming something that you will soon have to relate to, and I'm here to help you prepare to do that. Last time we spoke about what's yours and what isn't, about boundaries and how to establish where one's personal responsibility ends and another begins. Today, in the first of our final 2 sessions that focus on psychology, we start looking at the place where all of this has been leading up to. And that is, what on earth do you do with it all? And specifically, how can you add value? But in order to do that, we need to ask another question first. And that is, what does adding value actually mean? Because at some point, particularly if your family has an operating business, there is an assumption that contribution must look a certain way. Working inside the company, sitting on boards, managing investments, taking formal responsibility. And if you're not doing those things, it can begin to feel as if you're somehow less useful. But contribution is more complicated than that. Many NextGen members can actually feel guilty about not working in the family business, and that often creates its very own form of pressure, a pressure that is implied through expectations, through assumptions, through the way that people speak about involvement. You begin to sense that contribution equals proximity, that being valuable means being operationally involved, but that is not always true. You may remember from session 6 when we spoke about building your own life, that independence is not rejection. The same principle applies here. Adding value does not necessarily mean stepping into an existing role simply because it exists. Sometimes that is a form of contribution, but sometimes it creates dependency, resentment, and confusion. I once worked with a family in northern Spain that owned a highly successful global business. 3 siblings from the next generation were approaching the point where the question of involvement could no longer be avoided. The oldest daughter joined the company immediately after university. Everyone expected it. She was capable, disciplined, and understood the business naturally. The youngest daughter had no interest in it whatsoever. She was working in London and remained largely outside the operational structure. The middle child, however, struggled. He felt that he should join, but every instinct told him not to. And because he did not know how else to contribute, he entered the business anyway. For several years, everything appeared fine. He attended meetings, took on projects, and was given increasing responsibility. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. His decisions were hesitant, his engagement inconsistent. He was present physically, but psychologically somewhere else altogether. Eventually, during a conversation we had late one evening in Madrid, he said something very honest. I think I joined because I thought saying no would mean I didn't care about my family. That was a key moment because contribution driven by guilt rarely becomes sustainable. Over time, it creates frustration, not only for you, but for the people around you as well. The system begins to carry someone who's there out of obligation rather than conviction, and systems notice that. So, if you're not working in the business, how do you add value? Well, that depends on how you define value. And this is where many families become very narrow in their thinking. They equate value with operational control, revenue, visibility, direct involvement. But if you step back and look carefully at strong families that endure over generations, contribution takes many forms. Some individuals build businesses inside the family system. Some preserve stability during periods of transition. Some improve governance. Some strengthen relationships between branches of the family. Some become trusted interpreters between generations. Some bring external perspective back into the system. Some simply ask the questions that no one else is asking. And all of those things create value. In session 10, we saw that governance is ultimately about how decisions are made and how relationships are protected. Well, protecting relationships is itself a form of contribution. Maintaining trust is a form of contribution. Bringing perspective from outside the family system is a form of contribution. Preventing drift, which we discussed in session 11, is a form of contribution. And this is where your thinking needs to become more nuanced, because families often become vulnerable when everyone contributes in exactly the same way. And that creates concentration, not resilience. If you worry that your contribution doesn't look like anyone else's, well, that's precisely what makes it valuable. One of the most useful next-gen members I ever encountered was a woman who never worked a single day inside her family's business empire. Her family owned logistics companies across Asia. Her brothers managed operations, her cousins handled investments. She became a clinical psychologist. At first, parts of the family viewed this almost as a rejection. It seemed disconnected from the real work of the family. But over time, whenever tensions emerged between family members, she could see dynamics that others completely missed. She understood communication, emotional patterns, silence, avoidance. She became one of the few people capable of holding difficult conversations without escalating. And eventually, even the senior generation began turning to her before major family meetings because she understood the human dimension of the system better than anyone else. Now, from the outside, her contribution did not look financial, but in reality it may have protected more value than some of the investment decisions being made around her. This is important to understand early, because if you define contribution too narrowly, you risk forcing yourself into roles that just don't fit your capabilities or your temperament. And over time, that weakens both you and the family system. In session 5, we saw that respect is built through competence and consistency, not inherited through position. The same applies here. Real contribution comes from areas where your engagement is genuine and sustained, not where it is performative. Sometimes people do judge contribution by its visibility, particularly in systems where contribution has historically been associated with operational leadership. Visibility is easier to recognize. Someone running a business division appears obviously valuable. Someone quietly improving relationships, governance, or long-term thinking is less immediately visible. But visibility and value are not always the same thing. One of the more dangerous assumptions in family systems is that only visible contribution matters. Because once that belief takes hold, people begin competing for visible roles. Influence becomes concentrated around operational activity. Other forms of contribution are simply dismissed. And over time, this creates imbalance. You saw something similar in session 14 when we discussed conflict. Much tension emerges when recognition feels uneven. If the system only recognizes one type of contribution, eventually those contributing in less visible ways begin to disengage, and disengagement causes drift. It's perfectly normal at your stage to not know where you can add value. In fact, trying to force clarity too early often creates worse outcomes than understanding to develop gradually. A contribution is usually discovered through engagement, not through abstract planning. At the beginning, you're observing, and over time, patterns emerge. You begin to notice where people consistently turn to you, where your judgment becomes useful, where your presence improves the quality of discussion, where your thinking brings clarity rather than confusion. And that is often where contribution begins, not through a title, but through repeated usefulness. This connects directly to what we discussed in session 9 about how decisions are really made. Influence does not always follow hierarchy. Some individuals become central because of judgment, stability, or trust, rather than formal authority. The same applies to value creation inside families. Some of the most important contributors are not the loudest, the richest, or most operationally involved. They are simply the people that others trust when things become uncertain. Remember in session 4 that identity must be built deliberately, not borrowed from the system around you. Contribution works in exactly the same way. If your contribution only exists because a role was handed to you, it remains fragile. But if it comes from capabilities that you genuinely developed yourself, then your value remains portable, stable, independent. And this is why external experience matters so much. Not because the family system is insufficient, but because the outside world reveals what you can actually do without the protection of your name. It sharpens competence, it exposes weakness, it builds perspective. And when you bring that back into the family system, your contribution becomes more grounded. I saw this very clearly with a German family whose wealth came from industrial engineering. One of the younger family members chose not to enter the business. Instead, he spent years working in environmental technology in Scandinavia. At first, the family viewed this as slightly irrelevant to their core activities, but 20 years later, when regulation and sustainability pressures began reshaping their industry, he became one of the most strategically valuable voices in the family, not because he had stayed close to the system, but because he had spent years outside it, developing expertise that the system itself did not possess. So, contribution is often misunderstood when viewed only in the short term. Families sometimes expect immediate usefulness, immediate involvement, immediate clarity. But the most valuable forms of contribution often emerge slowly through experience, through maturity, through capabilities developed elsewhere. And this requires something difficult from both generations: trust. The older generation must allow space for contribution to develop differently than before, and your generation must accept that contribution cannot be forced into existence prematurely. Sometimes a family genuinely expects the next gen member to join the business, and sometimes the expectation is quite reasonable. Family businesses do require continuity. Responsibility does need to pass somewhere. But even then, the question remains the same. How can you contribute most effectively over the long term? That may involve operational involvement, but if it does, it should ideally come from alignment rather than obligation. In session 13, we saw that comfortable decisions are not always the best decisions. Joining a family business because it reduces tension can be one of those comfortable decisions. Everyone feels reassured. The system continues unchanged. But if the alignment is not real, the cost emerges later. That does not mean refusing automatically. It just means thinking carefully before committing. What strengths do you actually bring? What kind of role fits your judgment and your temperament? Where are you naturally credible? Where do you struggle? Those questions matter far more than appearances. Because contribution is not measured by proximity alone. It is measured by whether your involvement genuinely strengthens the system. And strengthening a system sometimes means leading from inside it. Sometimes it means supporting it from outside. Sometimes it means protecting relationship. And sometimes it means bringing perspective no one else has. And sometimes, quite simply, it means being willing to engage honestly rather than perform a role that never truly fit you in the first place. There is another misunderstanding that often appears around contribution. People begin to assume that adding value means proving usefulness continuously, always being active, always participating, always demonstrating involvement. But systems like yours do not necessarily become stronger because more people are constantly involved. In fact, the opposite can happen. Activity can begin to replace clarity. Visibility can begin to replace judgment. In session 9, we saw that good decision-making is often less about speaking more and more about understanding timing, context, and influence. Contribution works similarly. The value you bring is not measured by how often you appear. It is measured by whether your presence improves the quality of the system when you do engage. That's key, because one of the easiest ways to lose perspective inside family systems is to become performatively involved, to attend because attendance is expected, to participate because absence feels uncomfortable, to say yes because saying no appears disloyal. Over time, this creates exhaustion and eventually resentment. The feeling of guilt when you focus on your life rather than the family can become very powerful if it's left unexamined, particularly in families where sacrifice and responsibility are highly valued. But there is an important difference between responsibility and absorption. A healthy system allows individuals to remain individuals. That sounds obvious, but in practice, many families struggle with it, particularly successful ones, because strong systems naturally pull people inward. There are resources, expectations, momentum, existing structures that are already functioning. And if you're not careful, your life gradually becomes organized around the system rather than alongside it. In session 6, we established that independence is not rebellion, it is structure. It is knowing what belongs to you and what belongs to the family system. The same applies here. Contribution becomes healthier when it comes from someone who still remains their own center of gravity. One of the clearest examples I ever saw of this involved a family in Switzerland whose wealth came from pharmaceuticals. The oldest daughter also became heavily involved very early. Boards, investment committees, family meetings, foundations. She was everywhere. Everyone praised her commitment. She looked, from the outside, like the ideal next-gen family member. But after about 10 years, she became increasingly frustrated, short-tempered, cynical. Eventually, during a private discussion, she admitted something quite painful. I don't actually know anymore whether I'm doing any of this because I care about it or because I became the person that everyone expects. She captured something important in those words. Contribution without boundaries eventually becomes identity erosion. You stop choosing a role, the role begins choosing you. And once that happens, judgment weakens. Why? Because you're no longer engaging deliberately. You're reacting continuously, trying to satisfy expectations, to maintain equilibrium, not to disappoint people, and systems built around expectation eventually consume enormous emotional energy. This is why external perspective matters so much. The people who contribute most effectively over the long term are often those who retain some distance. Not emotional distance, but perspective. They can still see the system clearly because they're not fully absorbed by it. They can recognize patterns. They can identify drift. They can challenge assumptions without feeling that their entire identity is under threat. Session 11 told us that decline often begins when systems start operating on momentum rather than conscious intention. The same thing can happen personally. Your involvement becomes automatic. You stop asking why you are participating. You simply continue because it has become expected. And that is where contribution starts losing quality. You avoid that by returning periodically to a very simple question. If this role did not already exist, would I still choose it? That question cuts through a great deal of confusion because it forces you to separate genuine alignment from inherited momentum. Sometimes the answer will be yes, sometimes no, sometimes partially, but whatever the answer is, it creates clarity, and clarity matters far more than appearance. One of the difficulties in wealthy families is that many roles already exist before you arrive. The board seat exists, the committee exists, the operating role exists, the foundation exists, the structure is waiting for someone to step into it. And because it already exists, it feels entirely natural to continue it. But continuity and suitability are not the same thing. A role can need filling and still not be right for you. This is where many next gen individuals become trapped. They confuse availability with obligation, and once inside the role, it becomes increasingly difficult to step back because expectations settle. The system adjusts to their presence. Others begin relying on them. Their identity becomes connected to the function itself. Now, this does not mean you should avoid responsibility. In fact, quite the opposite. Responsibility matters enormously, but responsibility should ideally be aligned with your capability, temperament, and conviction. Otherwise, a contribution becomes mechanical rather than meaningful. What can often happen is that your strengths are not the kind that your family easily recognize, particularly in systems shaped by founders or operational leadership cultures. Families tend to recognize what they understand: commercial ability, decisiveness, operational control, financial skill. Those forms of contribution are highly visible and easy to measure. Other forms are less obvious. Emotional intelligence, relationship management, long-term thinking, communication, the ability to stabilize difficult conversations, the ability to connect generations, the ability to maintain perspective under pressure. These are harder to quantify, but in complex family systems, they are often just as valuable. You saw this in session 14 when we discussed conflict. Most conflict inside wealthy families is not actually about money. It's about control, identity, and fear, which means that the people who can manage those dimensions effectively are contributing enormous value, even if their role does not look operational from the outside. I once worked with a family where two brothers constantly dominated every formal discussion, both highly capable, highly intelligent, highly successful commercially. But every meeting became exhausting because both viewed every disagreement as something to win. Their sister, by contrast, spoke relatively little. She was not operationally involved in the business, but she had a remarkable ability to lower tension in the room, to reframe issues calmly, to stop conversations becoming positional. Over time, more and more important discussions began taking place only when she was present, not because she had formal authority, but because she improved the quality of decision-making simply through how she engaged. That is contribution, and it illustrates something important. And that is that influence inside systems does not always come from formal power. Sometimes it just comes from trust, stability, judgment, and emotional consistency. You may remember this directly from session 9, where we discussed how influence often sits outside visible hierarchies. Families that endure over generations eventually learn this lesson. The strongest systems are not built only around operators. They are built around complementary forms of capability, different strengths reinforcing each other. There is also another point worth understanding, and that is that you do not need to justify every form of contribution immediately. One of the mistakes that many younger family members make is trying to explain or defend their path too early. They want everyone to understand the logic immediately, but contribution often only becomes fully visible over time. The environmental specialist looked irrelevant until regulation changed. The psychologist looked peripheral until family tensions intensified. The independent entrepreneur looked disconnected until the family needed fresh perspective. At the beginning, systems often resist unfamiliar forms of value because they cannot yet measure them clearly. That is normal. It does not necessarily mean that your direction is wrong. It just requires patience and confidence that contribution can take different forms, because recognition inside family systems is often delayed. In session 5, we saw that respect is built gradually through repeated behavior, not inherited instantly. Contribution works in exactly the same way. Over time, if your judgment proves useful, presence strengthens relationships. The system begins adjusting around. but this process cannot be rushed artificially. Session 3 taught us that systems evolve whether consciously or not. Families that survive well over time usually allow contribution to diversify, and that diversity creates resilience because the future rarely rewards systems that think in only one way. At this stage, then, your task is not to force yourself into usefulness prematurely. It is to understand where your contribution can become authentic, where your capability and the needs of the system can genuinely intersect, and where your involvement can strengthen the family, not simply because you are present, but because you bring something meaningful that the world would otherwise be missing. And perhaps that is the real shift that has been taking place throughout all these conversations. At the beginning, you may have thought the responsibility inside a family like yours was mainly about learning structures, understanding investments, or preparing to make decisions. And don't get me wrong, those things do matter. But underneath them sits something far deeper. Learning how to remain yourself inside a system powerful enough to shape your identity if you let it. Because adding value is not simply about filling a role. It's not about visibility, proximity, or proving your usefulness constantly. It's about understanding what you can genuinely sustain over time without losing clarity, judgment, or yourself in the process. Some people will contribute by leading businesses, some by protecting relationships, some by bringing outside perspective back into the family, some by strengthening governance, some by asking difficult questions when everyone else is avoiding them, and some will become the emotional stabilizers of the entire system without ever holding a formal role. What matters is not whether your contribution looks impressive from the outside. What matters is whether it strengthens the system in a way that is real, durable, and aligned with who you actually are. Because systems built only around obligation eventually become brittle and break. But systems strengthened by capability, trust, and thoughtful engagement become resilient. And over time, people will notice something important about you. Not that you tried to become indispensable, but that when you were present, things became clearer. And that, in the end, is what real contribution usually looks like. Join me next time in our second session of this segment on psychology and final formal episode, where we focus on what you can do with all that you've learned from these sessions and look at stewardship, that task which will become your main activity once it all finally becomes your responsibility. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.